the Nava, we're in Daf Pei Bet, Amud Bet today. Today is Pei Gimel, right? You got to the Mishnah. Well, in the Mishnah, which we haven't quite learned yet for you, there was a machloket about a person who says that he wants to bring a toda, carbon toda. Mishnah said you only bring it from chulin, and the proof to that is carbon pesach. That just like the good timing, right? Just like the carbon pesach can only come from chulin, so too the all other carbonot, including carbon mincha, can only come from chulin. How do we know carbon pesach can only come from how do we know to compare everything to carbon pesach? So we quoted this interesting pasuk, this unusual pasuk, which we've had many times, which says "V'zavachta pesach l'Hashem Elokecha tzonu bakar." Shecht your pesach as tzon, which is sheep, and bakar is cattle, which of course makes no sense because you never bring a carbon pesach from cattle. So drasha was that just like Pesach is this way, every other carbon shlamim, and therefore every other carbon is the same way. Karbanot that are tzonu bakar. So we learn from Pesach that you just like Pesach has to be brought from free money as opposed to maaser money. So too, a mincha has to be brought from free money. And how do you know a Pesach has to be brought from free money, not maaser money? So the presumable answer is because there was no maaser at the time of Pesach.
There was no Maaser Sheni, right?
Right,
It
it didn't
didn't have
exist yet.
that, right?
Since it didn't exist yet, obviously it came
Yeah.
from free money. And Rabbi Akiva said back in the Mishnah, well, that you can't be done in Efshar, Mishi'i Efshar, right? You can't prove anything from there because they didn't have Maaser. So that's why they couldn't do it. But how do you know nowadays that you can't? So Rabbi Akiva had another source. So let's just read what he got up to apparently, which is Rabbi Akiva. Pesach, de'enu ba ela min hachula min alei. So how does Rabbi Akiva himself know that a Pesach can only come from chulin as opposed to maaser? Again, the Tana Rabbi Yishmael, I think it was, right? The other Tana,
No, isn't it?
Rabbi Eliezer, sorry.
Eliezer.
Yeah,
Rabbi
thank you.
Eliezer, yeah.
Rabbi Eliezer said it was from Pesach, but Rabbi Akiva said you can't do that. So what's Rabbi Akiva's source? Where am I? So Rabbi Akiva Pesach Deinu Ba'elam Min Achulim Min Nalei Nafklei Mihada Amar Shmuel Mishum Rabbi Eliezer. There was a quote of Shmuel in the name of the Tana Rabbi Eliezer of the famous pasuk. This is actually a good place to start. There's a famous pasuk in Parashat Tzav which says Zot Torah. This is the rules. La'ola, lemincha, lechatat, la'sham, la'miluim, zevach hashlamim. We list all the carbonot. And of course, we say whenever you list everything, it's to compare them to each other. And so the reason the Torah does this general thing is to tell you that there are rules about every single carbon that apply to the other carbonot. And now we're going to go one at a time and learn something from each word in this pasuk. So the first one we learn from is the word olah. What do we learn from olah that applies to every other carbon? Ma olah tuna kli avkota unkli. Just like an olah needs to have a vessel, every carbon needs to have a vessel. What do you mean? What's a kli? What kli do you need for an olah? If you think it means that the cup that you catch the blood into, right, that you need to have a pan basically to catch the blood for an olah, would do kabbalat hadam. You can't do it in your hand, for example, or on a piece of cloth, right? So we learn from the olah, just like you know that by the olah, you know that by everything else. But that's not, it's said by Gabe Zivche Shalmei Tzibor, Nami Ktiv, by Zivche Shalmei Tzibor, another one of the list, it says, Vayasam Ba'aganot, right? They shechted it and they put it in containers. So we don't need Ola to teach you that. You have another source for that. Ella, the object we're talking about Ola is not the cup you accept it in. It's the knife you use to slaughter the Ola. It's sakin. It's to tell you need to have a knife, as opposed, we talked about this many times already, as opposed to taking a piece of rock, let's say, right, or using your nails or something. You know what I mean? You can't use something else that's sharp. You have to actually fashion a knife in order to shecht your carbon Ola. And so that we learn from Ola to every other carbon. It says, well, how do you know by Ola? It doesn't say anything about a knife by Ola. Ola gufa min Ola. How do you know that an Ola needs a knife? Dichtiv, because it says by the very famous Ola, which was Yitzchak on Har HaMoriah, Vayishlach Avraham et yado, vayikach et ha'ma'achelet l'shchatet beno. Right? Avram stretched out his hand and took the ma'achelet, which means the knife, to slaughter his son. Right? And Yitzchak, of course, was a carbon Ola because he wasn't going to be eaten, right? The Hatam Olahu, and the way we know he was an Ola Defib, because it says, Hashem said to Avraham, bring your son, Vayal, I'm sorry, when he took the replacement of the animal that he found, it says he found the new animal, Vayaleo Ola Tachat Beno, so that the animal was an Ola instead of his son. And there it clearly says a knife, and therefore that we learn from Ola that everything needs a knife. So that's the first limit from the pasuk. Now continues the pasuk. Again, we're bringing this whole thing, we'll get to it eventually, to prove that Rabbi Akiva has a source for how you know that the carbon Pesach has to come from chulin. Okay, but we're not there yet. So the next word in the pasuk is the olah v'la mincha. What do we learn from mincha to every other karban? Ma mincha einu nenachal el zichrei kuna. Just like a karban mincha is kodesh kodashim, it's only eaten by the male kohanim, the mincha, the shirayim, right? Afkol ein nechalim el zichrei kuna. All other karbanot in this pasuk are only eaten by zichrei kuna. Which carbon are you talking about? My ichatat v'asham. If you're referring to the carbon chatat and asham, which are kache kadashim and only eaten by male kohanim, well, you don't need a limud from mincha to tell you that. It says by each one, by every karban chatas, it says eat it by zichrei kuna. By asham, it says the same thing. So what do you mean you learn from mincha? And if you're referring to Zivchei Shalmei Tzibor, where it doesn't say by Zivchei Shalmei Tzibor, which remember is the one shlamim that's Kodesh Kodashim, and it can only be eaten by the Zichrei Kuhuna, it doesn't say in the pasuk by Zivchei Shalmei Tzibor. Remember Zivchei Shalmei Tzibor, the svachim that you brought on Shavuot, L'shtei Alechem, and the Kvasim, right? The Kvasim. So if it's talking about Zivchei Shalmei Tzibor, but we learned earlier, Mirabuyad Dekrati, there is another pasuk that already taught us that, meaning you wouldn't need the word mincha to teach you that. What was the other limud? It says, "Bekodesh kadashim tochlenu, kol zachar yochaloto." It says, and this is an extra pasuk that tells you, limud al zivchei shalmei tzibur sheinechem al zivchei kuna. It's an extra pasuk that tells you that zivchei shalmei tzibur is also eaten by male kohanim. So if we learn it from a different pasuk, why would you need the word mincha to tell you that? It says the Gemara, in fact, it's a tanai. It's a machloket tanaim. There's different Tanaim. There's a Tana that we just quoted that learns it from this pasuk of Kodesh Kodashim Tochlenu, and there's another Tana that learns it out from the word Mincha in this pasuk.
So wait a second. The story about the male Kohanim, that means that they couldn't share with their family, basically. Is that what it means?
Correct. The Mincha cannot be shared with their family.
Because otherwise their wives or daughters were allowed to actually partake in the
So remember, Karban Chatat cannot be shared with your family, only a Shlamim.
So only the shlamim, right? That's why I was like a little bit like confused.
Right.
All right, thank you.
No, the Toda is different. So the Toda is not the same as the regular mincha because you take the loaves of the Toda home and you eat them. So the Toda is not eaten by Zichrei Kuna. The Toda is eaten by the owner. But the Shirayim of a mincha, like every mincha, is eaten by only Zichrei Kohen because it's Kodesh
Okay.
Kodesh. I learned that before, right? So it says more Tanai. In fact, it's a machloket Tanaim, the fifth line. Ika damaiti lemehacha. Some learn out the source that Zivchei Shalmei Tzibor are Kodesh Kodashim and only in by Zichrei Kuna from this pasuk. Ika damaiti lemehacha, and some learn it from that pasuk. So that's this Braita, which says that the word mincha is there to teach you that Shalmei Tzibor eaten by the Zichrei Kuna is a machloket Tanaim with the other Braita. Okay, so again, we haven't got to our point yet. Our point is to get how Rabbi Akiva knows that you can only bring Karban Pesach from Chulin. But be patient, we're going to get there. The next word in the pasuk is, where am I?
Chata.
Chatat, right? So it says, La'olah, la mincha, v'lechatat. What do we learn from that? Then ma chatat mikadsha bibalua, afko mikadsha bibalua. Remember, we had this long discussion at the end of Zvachim, longer than some of us thought it should be, about how the liquid, the juice of the chatat that gets absorbed into a vessel, you have to wash it, you have to clean it, you have to get kedusha, but that basically the juice or the liquid of the chatat is mikadesh anything it touches. So that if chatat touches a piece of bread, that bread has to then be eaten like the karban chatat. Well, the Torah says that. And so we learn from chatat that applies by other karbanot too. That if you have another karban that touches, let's say an asham, that touches a piece of bread, then that bread has the same status of the karban. So that we learn from chatat. The next word in the pasuk is asham. It says asham. What do we learn from asham? Now, ma asham ein shvir v'shilya kadosh bo. Right? There's something very interesting about asham. And asham, the fetus, and I think shvir and shvilya, one's the fetus and one is the placenta, right? I don't know which is which, but
one is the fetus and one is the amniotic sac.
Oh, great. Okay, so those are not kadosh. Now, how do we know that they're not kadosh by an asham, Nava? This is a trick question. Because an asham has to be a male animal. And male animals do not have fetuses, right? So by definition, asham cannot have a problem, an issue, called a problem, where it has a fetus or it has a amniotic sac or a uterus, not a uterus, a placenta inside of it. So by definition, an asham never can have kedusha of its placenta. So too, every other karban, like other karbanot, like a chatas or a shlamim, it can be female. But if you dedicate a karban chatat and then it gets pregnant, that kedusha does not apply to the placenta and the fetus, right? We learned that from Asham. So just like Asham ein shvir v'shilya kadosh ba, Avkol ein shvir v'shilya kadosh ba, because Kasamar, this Tana holds, this was a machloka we've had many times also, vladot kachim, that the children of kachim, meaning if you dedicate an animal and then it gives birth, ahaviyatan hein kedoshim, they only become kodesh when they are born, meaning up till the time they're born, they don't have kedusha. And so if you shech the mother and you find this shvir inside of it, it's not kodesh. And we learned that from the Asham, which by definition can't have a shvir because it's male. Now, of course, this goes against Rabbi Akiva a little bit because here you are danin efshar mishi efshar, right? You're learning a situation where it's possible to have a fetus, a chatas, from a case of Asham where it's not. Torah didn't say a fetus is not kodesh by an Asham. It said that you can't have a fetus, but we are learning efshar mishi efshar.
So when you shecht it and then upon the sacrifice you discover it was pregnant. Because if you made it hektish and then it had the baby, then the baby would be considered hektish too.
If it had the baby would become hektish.
So right? This is the case where you slaughtered it
Correct.
and it was pregnant.
Correct. So that's what Haviyaton means. Haviyaton means they become kodesh when they exist, meaning when they come out of the mother. Okay? V'danin efshar mishi efshar. The next case, and again, we're still going through this pasuk, right? So again, the pasuk said, Zot Torah lo'la lemincha chatat lasham. The next case was Lam Miluim. We are 10 lines from the top of Daf Pei Gimel Amud Aleph.
5 periods.
What do we learn from Miluim? That Ma Miluim Motrehem Bisreifa. When you have the Miluim, the extra, the leftover of a Miluim has to be burned. And the reason Rashi, or whoever the spiritual Rashi is that by Miluim, as opposed to a regular Karban, right? And we're going to get into this actually a lot today, maybe, and tomorrow. Maybe. Today, I think some karbanot like Pesach, this is the famous case. If you put aside money for your karban Pesach, right, and you have leftover money at the end, you're supposed to use that money to buy other kachim. We're going to discuss that. But the miluim were different. The reason the miluim were different is that the miluim were brought by the priests, right, or the nesiim to dedicate the Beit HaMikdash. So it was a one-time thing. So if you had extra money left over at the end of the miluim, there was no second miluim that you can spend that on. And so because there's no concept of achrayut, of miluim, if you have money or animals, let's say, left over after the miluim, like let's say, again, the case with Pesach, which we're going to get to, so that's why I'm telling you it, is you set aside an animal for your karban Pesach, and then you lose it, right? And you go, which happens to us all the time, and then you go find another animal and dedicate that for your karban Pesach, and then you find the first one. So you have to bring the second one. You can bring either one you want, actually, but the one that you don't bring has a karban, has a status. But if the miluim did that, if they put aside an animal and lost it and they brought another one, and then they came back and they found the first one, there's no carbon to bring from that animal. So you basically have to kill that animal and burn it, or if it's money, you burn the money, because you can't do anything with it. You just get rid of it. So just like miluim, by definition, motrehem b'sreifa, right? The miluim, sorry, I gave the longer case. The extra leftovers by miluim, Rashi says, talking about again, this is Pirush and Rashi, the first part is what I meant to say, that if you have meat left over from miluim, right? So you have a karban miluim and it stays overnight, and the next morning it becomes lina. So then you burn it, right? V'sarafta notar b'eish, the pasuk says. But ein balei chayim motrehem b'sreifa. But, or the Girsa Rashi has is ein motrehem balei chayim b'sreifa. That if you have an extra animal, you never kill it. And the reason again is that you would never have a second animal from miluim. Because by definition, the miluim was the gift. The miluim was not a responsibility. It was the gift that was brought by the miluim. So there's never a second animal that will be left alive from the miluim. So Kol, the same thing then is true by all other karbanot. Motrehem b'sreifa, right? The leftover of a karban chatas, let's say, or shlamim after 2 days or after 1 day, you have to burn the leftover meat. Ve'ein balei chayim motrehem b'sreifa. But if you have animals left over, and again, remember the classic case of a chatat was a chatat shenitchapru ba'aleh ba'acher, right? The owners of the chatat brought a different animal, so now you have its karban chatat, and you've got nothing to do with it. You don't kill that animal. You don't burn that animal, right? Which you might have thought you should do. What do? You let it graze until it gets a mum, and then it dies, etc. But you're never supposed to actually physically kill the animal, just like by miluim, you would have never killed the animal. So that's what we learn from miluim. The last one in the pasuk, maybe I'm up to the last one, is shlamim. And what do we learn from shlamim to all other karbanot? And this, of course, is familiar to everyone from Zvachim, which is that if you recall, the concept of pigol is written by shlamim. It doesn't say pigol by any other karban. But we learn from the shlamim, ma shlamim mifaglim or mitpaglim. Shlamim, it can become pigol. It can make other things pigol. Tosas' pshat here, which is very simple and not like Rashi's, is that mifagel mitpaglim means that if you have a thought while you're doing the shechita, it becomes pigol about the shechita, and if you have a thought about the zrika while you're doing shechita, it becomes pigol also. So the act can be pigol, and it can be thinking about something else. Rashi is a very complicated pshat about that you can make other things pigol along with it. Meaning, if you shecht the kivsei atzeret to think about eating the bread the wrong day, it can become pigol, right? Which is an interesting case, but it only applies to a couple karbanot that have something that comes with it. So either way, shlamim is mifaglim or mitpaglim. Afkol mifaglim or mitpaglim. So too you can have pigol. Okay, so anyways, this is the long explanation of the of Zot. Torah, Lola, etc., etc. Now, why are we quoting it? For the next words. Tana Mishmeid Rabbi Akiva, there's another Braita, a Tana, who quoted Rabbi Akiva as having a slightly different version of this Braita. And in this version, Zot Torah, etc., 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 we're not going to make you read the whole thing again, but the word mincha, which remember in the first version, we use the word mincha to tell you that only Zechrei Kuna could eat it, right? In this version, Rabbi Akiva said that the halacha that we learn from mincha is ma mincha mikadeshet bibalua, avkol mikadeshet bibalua. That just like a mincha, a karban mincha that touches another piece of bread, let's say, the halacha of that new piece of bread follows the original one, meaning it shares its kedusha. So too, it's true by all other karbanot. Now we just learned the same thing from chatat. It says, but according to this version, you'd have to say it both by chatat and you'd have to say it by mincha. If it only said by mincha that the kedusha of the mincha passes on, you might think mishum derech bala, because it's soft, right? A mincha is oil and flour, so it spreads. Meaning, if something touches that, it gets on it, it attaches to it, and it's hard to separate them, unlike a piece of meat where you just take the meat off, right? Aval chatat emalo v'ikatar rachmana chatat. You might say no. Chatat is a little different because a chatat has a lot of fat on it. Mishum debasar agav deshamein kadir. Right, the meat of the chatat is very juicy, fatty, and so therefore it sticks to other things. Right, it's hard to get fat off. As everyone knows, if you wash dishes or wash something off. Ava mincha emalo tzricha, and therefore that's why you have a pasuk for both. Okay, now that's one version. Continues the Braita, and we're getting to the point in a minute. It says chatat. What do we learn from the word chatat according to the second Braita? That ma chatat eno ba ela min hachulin ubiyom ubiyada yemanit, just like a karban chatat can only be brought from chulin. But finally, we're getting to our point, right? Our question we're starting with is, how do you know that if you bring a karban, you have to bring it from chulin, not from maser sheni? So it says the Braita now, we learn it from chatat. Just like a chatat can only come from chulin, right? And it can only come during the day, and it can only be done using your right hand. Afkol eno ba ela min hachulin ubiyom ubiyada min yemanit. So too, all the other karbanot, including karban pesach, can only be done by chulin, which is again the limit of Rabbi Akiva, and in your right hand and during the day, right? We don't bring karbanot at night. It says, okay, so now we know how Rabbi Akiva knows that a karban pesach has to be done by chulin, because we learn it from chatas. A chatas has to come from chulin. Now, how do you know a chatas has to come from chulin? Says the Gemara. Chatas gufa minalan. Right, so we're going to this circle and circle and circle. We keep learning one thing from the next, but how do you know karban chatat can't come from money of maser sheni? Right? Let's say a person has a lot of maser sheni money and they do a sin and they have to bring a karban chatat. How do you know that has to come from chulin? Amar Rav Chisda, says Rav Chisda, that's based on a whole nother pasuk. Amar Krak, because the pasuk says, this is now referring to really Yom Kippur, but it says v'hikriv Aaron et para chatat asher lo. And if Aaron brings the chatat, that is his. What do we learn from Asher Lo? Mishelo. It has to be he owns it, meaning he spent his own money on it. Velo Mishel Maser. And it can't come from Maser money. So this is finally the limud that a karban chatat, now of course this is a very special chatat of Yom Kippur, but we learn from this chatat to every chatat, that a chatat has to come from your own private money. And we learn according to Rabbi Akiva that karban pesach is like a karban chatat. And then, of course, in the Mishnah, we learn that every other Karban Mincha is like a Karban Pesach. So it's a couple steps away. Now, the next halacha, just to finish the sentence, though, is that we said it can't come, it has to be biyom, right? How do we know that a Karban Chatat has to be done during the day? Because it says, biyom tzavato nafka. It says the Gemara, what do you need a pasuk to tell me that every Karban is like a Karban Chatat has to be done during the day? It says already that biyom tzavato, Moshe commanded them during the day, that every Karban has to be done during the day. You know that from other psukim. This is when you're right. You know from other psukim, kidi naspa. We just threw it in for it was a nice poetic twist, right? So we said, just like the chatat is chulin and the day, it's true. You don't actually need to learn chatat from the day. You don't need to learn the day from chatat. We know it from other psukim. And what about yado yamanit? What about the limud, the third limud we had from chatat, that you have to use your right hand to do all the avodah? Why don't you know that midraba bar Chana nafka? Why can't we know that from Rabba bar Chana? Dam Rabba bar Chana, Amar Reish Lakish, Kol makom shenemar etzbal kunayin al yamin. Anytime the Torah says a unit, a finger, and it says a kohen, it automatically means right. And we learned before about how we know this. But then, by every shlamim, it says the right hand. It says hand. By every ola, by every mincha. So what do you need chatas to teach you that? This is where you're right. We don't need to know from chatas. That's also el yamin kedi nazma. That one also is extra. So really, the only thing we're learning from karban chatat is that it has to come min hachulin. And the way we learn that from Chatat is that by Yom Kippur, it says that Aaron HaKohen had to bring the carbon from Chulin, Mishalo, so that's the limud. Okay, so that, again, is why we're quoting this whole Braita. The last page and a half is just for this, what we just quoted. But we're not done, so let's finish the Braita. According to Rabbi Akiva's version of the Braita, what do we learn from Asham? Where am I? Asham, it's 2 lines from the bottom. What do we learn from Asham to every other Karban? Ma Asham atzmotav mutarim. Just like a karban asham, the bones of the asham are mutar to be used. Now, again, these are bones that don't have marrow in them, right? So you can use them to make spoons out of them, right? They used to use bones for all kinds of purposes. You're allowed to use the bones of an animal. It's not like notar, it's not left over, because it's considered to be like the skin, basically. So afkol atzmotehem, atzmotav mutarim, so to all their karbanot, the bones are mutar. It says where Rabbi Akiva, Hi v'zavachta Pesach my avidlei. So now Rabbi Akiva basically has a whole alternate explanation, right? Rabbi Akiva no longer needs to use the pasuk of zavachta Pesach tzonu bakar to tell you, right? Again, the question is, a Pesach can't be tzonu bakar. So Rabbi Eliezer learned it's telling you just like a Pesach has to come from free money, every karban has to come from free money. But Rabbi Akiva just learned that from a chatat. Just like the chatat has to come from the kohen's own money, every karban has to come from your own money. So what do you need? What is the pasuk? Shecht your karban pesach from tzonu bakar. It makes no sense. What does it mean according to Rabbi Akiva? My avidlei mi Rav Nachman. He uses that for the saying of Rav Nachman. Again, the Gemara always does this. Rav Nachman lived, 150 years, 200 years after Rabbi Akiva. So obviously, it's not for it's not like he was 100 years, 150. The Amar of Nachman is Rav Nachman said in the name of Rabbi Bar Avua, Ninayan, and this is what I was referencing earlier. How do you know that the motar hapesach karev shlamim? How do you know that if you have leftover from your karban pesach, that you should use it, either money, right? Let's say you set aside $1,000 for your karban pesach, and you got to the store and the sheeps were $800, right? So you have $200 left. Or let's say the case I gave earlier, you actually set aside an animal and then you lose it and you set aside a second animal and you have an extra animal that was set aside as a karban pesach. How do you know that that can be brought as a karban shlamim? Shenamar, it's based on this pasuk, as it says, "V'zavachta Pesach Hashem Elokecha, shecht your karban Pesach to Hashem tzon ubakar, as sheep or cattle." Asked the Gemara, as we've said many times, "Hello, ein Pesach ba'el min hakvasim min hayizim." Pesach only comes from sheep. Ella, what the pasuk is telling you is, the pasuk is telling you it's going to happen again. Ella, the pasuk is telling you that motar pesach yeheil davar ba min hatzon min habakar. Okay, what the pasuk is telling you is that leftovers from your pesach can be used for a karban that can come from small animals or large animals, and the only karban that can come from those animals is a shlamim. Okay, so that's what Rabbi Akiva does from the pasuk. This is why that's a wonderful limud, but we already know this limud. Rabbi Hachanafka, do you actually need to learn from the pasuk of Zavachta Pesach that leftover from Pesach is brought as a shlamim? Midavu Shmot Dishmo Nafka. We learn that from the pasuk quoted by Avua Dishmo Dichtiv, because the pasuk says, and again, there's a different girsaot here. The pasuk says, "V'im," add the vav, "V'im min hatzon karbano l'zevach hashlamim." If you're going to bring a karban from tzon, bring it for zevach shlamim, which doesn't make a lot of sense because not every karban shlamim has to come from tzon, right? And so what the Torah is telling you, v'amara v'ued shmo, what it tells you is davar haba min hatzon, the karban that has to come from tzon, which is the karban pesach, yehei l'zevach shlamim, can sometimes become a shlamim.
And Pesach is a glorified shlamim.
Maybe, can sometimes be a karban shlamim, which is, of course, the case where you have leftover from the Pesach and becomes a shlamim. So that is a second proof of the exact same halacha, that if you have leftover money for your Pesach or a leftover animal for your Pesach, bring it as a shlamim. And says Gemara, before you answer my question about why you need two psukim, there's actually a third pasuk. Akati mehacha nafka, mehatim nafka. There's a whole nother source that tells you the exact same halacha. Hatanya, because there's a brayta that says, it says the word keves, right? This is the im keves karbano, I think. The rabot pesach la'alya. Oh, sorry, before we get to the im. The word keves tells you that a karban pesach that's brought from a sheep, you take the alya. Remember, the alya is the fat pad behind the tail of the animal, and you put that on the mizbeach. So you're supposed to take the alya and put it on the mizbeach. You know, every animal has a little bit of fat there. Some are considered to be an alya and some are not. So this is telling you that by karban pesach, you put the alya on the mizbeach. Kishohu omer im keves, when it has the extra word im, it's lahavi to tell you pesach shavra shnato, that if you have a pesach whose year has passed, right, meaning a pesach, remember, has to be a first-year-old animal. You dedicate a karban pesach, and then it gets too old, and it ages out, so it was a karban, so it's going to be a shlamim in a second. And this, and the next words are a little controversial, shlamim haba'im machmat pesach, or shlamim that come with the karban pesach, that those animals, Rashi, let me see if Rashi here says, yeah, Rashi here says that shlamim haba'im machmat pesach is a shlamim that comes because you had leftover Pesach, meaning a motar Pesach, lechom nitzvot shlamim, that it is treated exactly like karban shlamim, right? Tosfos here quotes a different Rashi in Zvachim, which is partly why we assume this isn't Rashi, who says that the shlamim that come with the Pesach is actually the karban chagiga. I forgot to talk about that in our Seder, but you always had a karban chagiga that you brought on Chagigat Yudalid, that you brought on the 14th, right? So the chagiga is treated like a shlamim. Anyways, Tosfos has a long discussion about that. But the bottom line is that the Braita says that the extra shlamim that comes from karban Pesach, yit'anu smicha, it's treated like a shlamim when you have to lean on the animal, which remember you have to do for a shlamim, unisachim, and you have to bring wine with it. Utnufat chazev shok, and you have to wave the chest, etc. And so, anyways, that's the end of the Braita, right? I'm sorry, it's not the end of the Braita. That's the middle of the Braita. But this part of the Braita tells you that the motar Pesach is treated like a shlamim, which again is the third proof that we've already had that that's the case. Continues the Braita though, Keshu Omer V'im Eis, when it has a vav before the word Eis, right? It says if you bring a goat, hifsak ha'inyan, and that teaches you limad al ha'eis she'enatuna alya, that when you bring a karban that's an Eis, I don't really know what an Eis is. I said a goat, but a goat, you don't. Yeah. A goat, thank you. You don't have to bring the fat tail. Either way, again, the Braita, that's a different halacha. But the bottom line is we now have three sources according to Rabbi Akiva, and two according to everybody else, for the exact same halacha. The halacha is basically, if you have leftover money from your karban Pesach or a leftover animal from the karban Pesach, bring it as a shlamim. But why would you need to tell me that three times, right? It seems very redundant. Says the Gemara, well, the truth is, tlata kraik TV, in fact, you need three sources for this one halacha. And the reason you need three sources is that there's many ways that an animal can become no longer usable for a Pesach and therefore become a shlamim. The most obvious way is if it's completely chad. The first one is la'avras mano v'avras shnato. The time of Pesach passed, right? So meaning the 14th of Nisan is gone. So no, karban Pesach is done, and the animal is too old. So no longer, it's not a karban Pesach, and it's not the time of the Pesach. So there, I would, if you had one pasuk, I would say that becomes a shlamim because it's just no longer in the category of Pesach. But the next case is chad is la'abraz mano v'lo avras shnato. Let's say the Zman of the Pesach passed, right? So you set aside your karban, you lost it, let's say. Pesach came, you had to do another animal. It's now Chol HaMoed Pesach, so you missed your chance. But the animal's still not too old. So that case, you might have thought that you still should use it for a karban Pesach. How could you still use it for a karban Pesach?
Shlamim.
for Pesach Sheni. Maybe you can get a second chance for this animal. So that is a second limud. V'chad, and the third is actually lo avraz manav lo avraz shnato, where it actually you didn't even pass the time yet. So let's say again, I'm speaking out what the Gemara is about to say in a second, which is let's say you put aside an animal, and your brother showed up and said, "I put aside an animal too," right? And now you basically have two animals set aside for your carbon Pesach. So you say, look, it's 5 days before Pesach. We have nothing to eat. Let's bring one as a shlamim and have plenty of food till Pesach. So that animal actually could still be a carbon Pesach, right? Because it's not a Rosh Nato. It's still the right age. It's not even Pesach yet. It's not a Rosh Mano. How do you know that because it's extra, you can just turn it into a shlamim? Tzricha. So that's why you need 3 psukim. And that's how I'm going to read now what I just spoke out. If we said only one pasuk and I thought it applied to an animal that's year past and it's Pesach past, Mishum de Idchile Legamri. It's definitely excluded from the carbon Pesach completely because it's too old and it's past the time. But an animal that you missed Pesach, but it's not yet a year old, the Pesach Sheni, maybe you have to dedicate that animal and go back to the marketplace and say, does anyone want to buy this animal or use this animal for Pesach Sheni? Because it's carbon Pesach. If you only said that second case, or the first and second, I would say it's because it's at least pushed off from Pesach Rishon. An animal that it hasn't even come Pesach yet. Like my case, it's 5 days before Pesach. The afilo lePesach Rishon nami chazi aim alone. Maybe you can't turn it into a shlamim before Pesach comes. Tzricha, and therefore your pasuk says you can. Right? So a carbon Pesach, even before Pesach, can be demoted. It may not be demoted, but it's treated like a shlamim, and then it gets all the halachot of a shlamim, which is very notable, because then eaten for 2 days, even though carbon Pesach will not be eaten for 2 days. So, Hadron lach hatoda haitaba. Continues now. Let's keep going. We have a few more minutes. Everyone's got patience.
Okay, let's go.
Says the Mishnah now. The next parak, we're in the 9th parak of Masechet Menachot, and it's actually a continuation, right? So we've actually, well, it's all continuations, but says the Mishnah now, and these are many halachot that are familiar to us because we've actually referenced many of them. Kol karbanot hatzibor, all public karbanot, v'hayachid, and individual karbanot, ba'in min haaretz u'michutz la'aretz. You can bring them from. Now, Rashi understands here, again, the Pirush of Rashi, that we're referring in this mission just to Karban Menachot. We're not referring to animals. Tosfos doesn't like that, but that's what Rashi says, that it's referring here to any mincha offerings. So every Karban Mincha, whether it's a Minchat Tzibor or a Minchat Yachid, it can come from grain that grew in Eretz, u'michutz la'aretz. It can grow from grain from the Ukraine, or Iowa, or Israel, okay? Mina chadash mina yashan, and it can come from fresh grain or it can come from old grain. And fresh and old here means grain that you just harvested, hasn't sat out for a while, or grain that's been sitting for a long time and is older and drier. Chutz min haomer shtei alechem. The 2 exceptions, one very appropriately tonight on the third night of the Omer, right? So except for the carbon Omer, which was brought 2 days ago, right, on the 2nd day of Pesach. And the Shtei Alechem, which is brought on Atzeret, and we've learned this before. Like Gemara actually is going to go through this, I think, tomorrow. The Omer comes from the Saurim, and the Shtei Alechem comes from the Chitin, right? So those karbanot, Einam Ba'in Ela Min HaChadash, they can only come from fresh grain. So you have to take freshly harvested grain, and as we learned before about how they harvested it the night before, right, we had the whole Gemara, you can only take freshly harvested grain, Min Haaretz, and it has to come from the land of Israel. And remember, we had this discussion before also, if it comes from the sky, right, etc., right? That was very memorable. So it has to come from Israel. The kulan, now all minachot, you have to bring good grain, no crummy grain from minachot. What does good grain mean? So miknis v'zatcha. If you come from these 2 places of machnis and zatcha, I don't know if someone has an English who says where these places are. But anyways, these are just these are names of places, they're proper nouns. Does he give any suggestions?
Nope. No.
Anyways, these were 2 places. I guess if you knew the Mishnah, maybe you were familiar with them. Those were alpha lesolet. They were a grade A solet. They were top teens list solet. Shni'ah lahen. Now, secondary, the second best place to get your grain is a place called Afurayim Babika. It's called Afurayim in the Bika. Again, I don't know exactly where that is, but probably it's in a valley. And so that's the second best. But the truth is, says our Mishnah, Kol Haaretzot Hayuk Sherot. Really, you could bring it from anywhere, meaning presumably anywhere in Eretz Yisrael. But Elamikan Hayum Miviyim, this is where they brought it from because that was where they had the best grain. Now, so that's our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says every mincha can come from Aretz Michutz Laaretz, Chadash and Yashan, for the Omer and the Shtei Alechem. Says the Gemara, Matinit and Zolki Tana. Our Mishnah goes against the following Tana. The Tanya, because there's another Braita that says something very different than our Mishnah. Says the Braita, Omer habam min hayashan kasher. Omer does not have to be the new grain. And Omer can come from old grain. And Shtei Alechem habaot min hayashan, if the Shtei Alechem come from the old grain, ksherot, they're also kasher. Ela shechisar mitzvah. You did it you didn't do it great. You did a grade B mitzvah, we'll call it, right? But it's kosher. B'di avad, it's kosher. Our Mishnah said you can't do it. This Braita clearly says you can do it. How do I know that? Because the pasuk says, Takriv et minchat bikurecha. This is the Braita. You can bring your minchat bikurecha afilo min aliyah. It doesn't say where you have to bring it from. Even go up to your attic, to your storehouse, where you keep your grain, and take grain from last year. It doesn't say that it has to be this year's grain. And Shtei Alechem dichtiv moshvot techem tavio. Now, Shtei Alechem, it says the pasuk moshvot techem tavio, right? You bring it from your dwelling places, and we learn from there, lo min chutza la'aretz. You don't bring it from outside of Eretz Yisrael, which we learned earlier. But we also can learn from the word moshvot techem, go to your house and bring whatever you have in your house. Afilu min ha'aliyah, whatever's in the attic. Says you just said the word Moshe Techem tells you it has to be from Chutz, can't be from Chutz La'aretz. How can you learn a second thing from the same pasuk? Ha'afikta. You already used that pasuk to tell you. Says no. Amarkra taviyu. It's not from the word Moshe Techem. It's from Moshe Techem taviyu. Bring it. We don't care where you bring it from. Go to your attic. Go to PJ's. Pick up some flour. That's all we care about. Afilu min ha'aliyah.
King Arthur.
Says the Gemara, but we had another limit from the word tavio. Because we learned earlier, this was a couple of weeks ago, I remember we learned it together, I believe, that how do we know? Remember, by the Shtei Alechem, the Torah tells you it's 2 loaves, 2 isaron of flour. And so those of us who are really good at math understand that each loaf is 1 isaron. And we learned from the Shtei Alechem that the Toda, which remember had 10 loaves of bread, of chametz, each loaf of chametz was 1 isaron. Right? Remember, we learned that. So we learned that from the same pasuk. To totally teach you. That anything you bring from somewhere else, remember the Shtei Alechem is chametz. The only other karban that's chametz is the toda, and so that the toda is the same ratio of 1 isaron for 1 dough, one loaf. It says, well, you're right. We need the pasuk tavi to tell you that. But in kain lichtav krat tavi, my taviu. Tavio shmamina tarti. So you actually see 2 things from this limud. One is that you can bring any grain you want, and the second is that it can be old. That's one limud. And the second is that just like by Shtei Alechem, each lechem is 1 isaron of flour. So too by the toda, each of the 10 lechem of chametz is 1 isaron of flour. Right? That's how we learn. That's 10 isaron for the chametz and 10 for the 30 that were matzah. Ask the Gemara Vachdiv, how could you say that you can bring it from the old stuff? The pasuk clearly says reshit, right? It says the word reshit. I don't have all the psukim in mind, but it says the word reshit. Karban reshit, I believe, is what it says.
Zion.
Sorry, the pasuk says karban reshit takrivo otam lashem by the Omer. So it says the first. How could you say it can be old? So, you're right, lemitzvah. It doesn't have to be the first. It should be the first. It's a nice thing to be the first. It doesn't. It's not makif. What about by the Shtei Alechem? It says chliv chadasha. It says bring the new one. Also, haimi boile the keditanya. In fact, the word chadasha is telling you something else. It's for the following Braita, because the Braita says Rabbi Natan, Rabbi Akiva Amru. Rabbi Natan and Rabbi Akiva said Shtei Alechem habaot min hayashan ksherot. That in fact, if you bring your Shtei Alechem from grain from last year, it's kosher. The pasuk said the new grain chadasha. Mani mekayim chadasha. It's telling you chadasha l'chol ha-menachot, that it has to be new for all the menachot, meaning you can't bring any mincha from new grain until you've brought the Shtei Alechem. But the Shtei Alechem does not have to be the new grain.
Interesting.
It just has to be the new mincha of that year. It says the Gemara now, okay, I think we're going to have to stop here then. It's now as a period. So we're going to stop here at the last line, even though we're not at the end of a sugya, but we'll get to the end.
The sugya is already here.
Okay, we're going to stop here. Yasher Koach, thank you for joining to learn. No, we're gonna do a few more lines. Miriam, can we do a few more lines? You got?
Of course.
Let's go to the Chudatz. I feel like it's helpful. Ad kan says we're now. Ad kan lo pligi ela b'chadash. Now remember, we quoted our Mishnah. And want to remember, our Mishnah said that every mincha can come from old or new Eretz Yisrael or Chutz La'aretz, except for Omer and Shtei Alechem. Then we quoted a Braita which said, no, the Omer and Shtei Alechem can come from the old grain. But we didn't say anything about coming from outside of Eretz Yisrael. So Ad kan lo pligi ela b'chadash. This Braita only argued about bringing the grain from new plate, from whether the Omer and Shtei Alechem need new grain or old grain. Avo be'aretz lo pligi. But when you came to the other halacha of our Mishnah about whether the grain needs to come from Eretz Yisrael or Chutz La'aretz, this Braita did not argue, and it made it sound that Omer Shtei Alechem mi Eretz in mi Chutz La'aretz lo. Okay, so our Mishnah said that, and the Braita said that. But in fact, there's someone who argues with that. Kiman deloki haitana. This goes against the third opinion of the Tana. The Tanya, there's a third Braita, it's our second Braita in our Mishnah, at the third line of Pei Daled Amud Aleph, which says, Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda Omer ba michutz la'aretz, which goes against everything we've ever thought, right? And Omer can come from outside of Eretz Yisrael. Umani mekayim kitavo el haaretz. Now, what about the fact that the Torah very clearly says about Karban Omer, which we read in this holiday, when you come to the land, you should bring an Omer, which implies that there's no such thing as Karban Omer outside of Eretz Yisrael, because if you're not living in Eretz Canaan, Eretz Yisrael, you don't have the grain for the Omer. So how do you explain that pasuk, which says kitavo el haaretz? That's only telling us not that the Omer has to come from Eretz Yisrael. It's that the Jewish people are not chayiv in the Karban Omer until they get into Eretz Yisrael, like many other mitzvot, like Maaser and other things. And in fact, what this Tana holds, and this is very relevant for us, though not anymore, right? In fact, this Tana holds that the prohibition of eating grain that's chadash before the Omer outside of Eretz Yisrael, right? This is a very big debate, as you probably know, right? Nowadays, many people, maybe not nowadays, but in old times, were not makbid. They did not keep yashan outside of Eretz Yisrael, right? And so this Tana must hold that the prohibition of chadash, meaning you're only allowed to eat old grain and not new grain, is b'chutz la'aretz, is do'oraiti, and that's based on the pasuk of Moshvot Techem. So the same Moshvot Techem that you referenced before to tell you that you have to bring the grain from Eretz Yisrael, this Tana holds you don't have to bring the grain from Eretz Yisrael. What does Moshvot Techem mean? It means the exact opposite. It means Kol Makom Shatem Yoshvim Mashma. Moshvot Techem does not mean Eretz Yisrael. It means wherever you live. The halacha is you have to be makbid on this Isser of Chadash. The Chitavo, and then when the Torah says only do the Omer when you get into Israel, it's not because the Omer doesn't come from Chutz La'aretz. It's Zman Biyahi, right? It's because only at the time that you go into Eretz Yisrael do you become Chayiv in the Omer, V'kivan Do'oraiti Akuvi Nami Makriva. And since Mido'oraita, grain that's new grain is prohibited outside of Israel, you can actually use that grain to bring your Karban Omer. So according to this third Tana, who obviously argues with our Mishnah, the Omer, and we're going to learn the same thing is true at Shtei Alechem, does not actually have to come from Israel. And then the pasuk says, "Moshvot Techem," it does not mean the grain has to come from Israel. It means that everywhere you live, you have to keep this prohibition. So that, of course, is a big debate halachically, as many of you probably know, and has very big implications today about whether you can have Cheerios before.
Oops. Okay.
Oh,
I don't know what happened. Okay, good night. That was successful.